The Tennessee Valley Authority, yes, it was to provide jobs, but it had so much more than that. It would also be this, and I didn't put this down here, but it would basically be to dam and flood control of the entire Tennessee River Valley. And this entire valley includes the Tennessee and the Cumberland River, where they would build a series of dams. There was always the issue of floods and flood control, but also irrigation. But the big thing is electricity. Most people in the South did not have access to electricity at this time. Well, most people in Montana did. And this would provide not only incredible jobs and opportunities for people there, but also electrification. That's one of the dams on the Tennessee. I think that's Muscle Shoals. And a very important recording studio would be built right there. But moving on. And this combined with the Rural Electrification Administration would be created to provide as much electricity and access to electricity for rural areas that did not have electricity. Much of Montana would be electrified, so to speak, because of the REA. And so this was an important part of the New Deal to get this, this massive element of the modern world to most people. And because it wasn't profitable for electrical utilities to build electrical generating facilities in rural areas. It just didn't make money. And so they weren't going to do it. And so this would be done by the government. And it would be one of Roosevelt's most proudest accomplishments. If you go to the FDR Memorial, it's a really cool memorial. It's in Washington, D.C. It's kind of in between with the Lincoln Memorial and Jefferson Memorial, right in the middle. They have a whole scene about this cascading waterfall to represent this. He loved the idea about going back to these rural areas. He would get treatment in this part of Georgia called Warm Springs, and we had a very great affinity for that. Now, the environmental issues that are going to come up down the road, they just frankly did not think about. They saw this as a march of progress. And so huge dam building areas, or building of dams. There's still elements of this here. For example, areas around Great Falls, there's an electrical co-op that provides their electricity, not Northwestern Energy, and that's from the REA. I should add Roosevelt's most proudest accomplishment was Social Security. That we're coming to. All right, here's another one. So this ties in with this whole thing of public works. Government jobs to build things. So this will provide not only jobs for people, but what we would call today infrastructure. Roads, buildings, bridges, much of the modern highway system, so much of the schools, parks, you name it, were built during the New Deal. We are still living on what was started in the New Deal. But the first New Deal, the first three job programs, and we mentioned the CCC already. The CWA and the PWA were relatively small. Civil works, public works. And in fact, in 34, they canceled the CWA. Civil works and public works. These are relatively small job programs, even though that's Grand Coulee Dam, the largest dam in the continent of the United States. And that would be built, started with PWA, not finished with PWA. These were, though, not quite big enough to deal with the massive problem of unemployment. Another massive part of the first New Deal, maybe the most important one, was GlassSteagall. And so this, named after two senators who were relatively conservative. And normally they would have been opposed to regulation, but as they saw, we better get strong regulation, or Roosevelt will be pushed for even stronger regulation. So this strong regulation was a compromise. And it was banking regulation. They were terrified about just the government taking over the banks and running them all probably through the post office. That's what they were doing. Use post offices in every town. There would be postal banks up until the 70s. Banking regulation. And so this would set limits for, like, they must have 10% of their deposits on reserve. Even though they play with that and they change what a reserve is. It could be bonds, it could be cash. That comes down the road. But it also, the two biggest elements, it's hard to say which is the most important. It divided investment banking and commercial banks. So commercial banks are what we think of when we think of banks. That's where you go get a loan. Maybe you go put your savings deposit or your savings deposit in there. You get a mortgage. You go to a commercial bank. And that's like, I'm just, Stockman's Bank or Valley Bank or, those are just basically commercial banks. Investment banks are banks that deal with speculation and finance. They're the ones who loan money for speculation in the stock market, speculation in real estate. They also help corporations set up their initial stock offerings. So these are the big financial banks. So for example, JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs. And they're the ones who deal with speculation, AKA gambling. And what was happening is these banks were combined. And so banks were using their commercial sector, people's savings in the bank, and allowing that to be gambled on the stock market. And so when the stock market crashed, the commercial side crashed. And so what the GlassSteagall said, separate. They will be two different banks and they can't combine. So this money here will not be gambled here. And for the next 60 years would lead to incredible stability in the banking system. Incredible stability. Of course, stability also meant that they weren't getting massive profits from bubbles. And then out of GlassSteagall would be created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And this would insure deposits in commercial banks, Not all the deposits. What was it? The first $1,500. Today it's $250,000. So about 99.5% of all savings are insured. The very large savings were not insured, but and the FDIC, here's FDIC right here. Any bank that agrees to it must pay premiums, and then they send inspectors out to banks. And especially before 1999 and 2000, if that bank was making risky loans, the FDIC would stop it. And in fact, they would shut down and take over banks that were operating too risky or nearing shutdown. And everybody's deposit in there, if it was insured by the FDIC, therefore would get almost everybody would get their money back. And these two parts of the GlassSteagall Act would just end the bank panics. Just end them. So this is kind of shocking. That's when FDIC was passed. Here's all the bank panics, all the bank closures during the Great Depression. Look what it was afterwards. It just didn't happen. It just never happened. Now, they deregulated the savings and loans to allow them to speculate more in the 1980s, and they all shut down. They all blew themselves up. Cost the federal government through the FDIC about $1 billion. Taxpayers. Yes.
They said that they would take over the banks and stuff until like 2000.
We're getting there. We're getting. And so this led to really boring banking. Of course, they didn't make the big profits, but everybody could count on the banks. And so this led to unprecedented stability. It's no coincidence that there were no financial panics, just none, in the second half of the 20th century. Just did not exist because people knew that if the bank, your deposits were insured, so even if the bank collapses, our deposit's safe. And so that kept people from running on healthy banks. And so everything's operating perfectly. There's flaws in it, and people weren't making the big profits they wanted, and they began to lobby Congress. And in 1999, they repealed GlassSteagall. A conservative Democrat, Bill Clinton, signed this. Some Democrats, but almost all Republicans voted for this. And some Democrats, there was a very big conservative, we're talking economically here, conservative Democratic wing, including our current president was one who voted for repealing this. And they allowed for this combination to happen. And they allowed for banks to get significantly bigger. And so they started gambling money that was protected in commercial banks, in the stock market, in real estate, what they're called real estate credit default swaps. They're just bonds, just speculation for the confluence. And it only took them, you got to admit, this is impressive. It only took them 8 years to destroy the entire banking system, lead to a financial crash. Now, you might notice there weren't as many closures here, partially because FDIC remained. So that saved a lot of banks, and there's just fewer banks because of monopolies. And instead of bringing back GlassSteagall, they brought up this very complex thing called Dodd-Frank to regulate banks. 2018, they deregulated more banks. Now supported by every member of Congress from Montana. They got a lot of money from banks for this. It was just in the paper this morning about this. How much money the two Montana senators got for voting for this. But that's what happened at Silicon Valley. They deregulated them. They had all these people put big money in, and then the FDIC came with the shove. But the problem is, since they didn't have the other previous regulation, they allowed it to get so bad they had to shut it down. Montana, I should add, this was also in the paper this morning, lost $3 million because of this. Montana's pension fund invested in the two banks that shut down. That's the kind of thing I just want to go hold hair on to. Why would you invest in banks that were under investigation for the Federal Reserve? All right, moving on. And so we've had two financial panics since, one huge one. And so that's why we have these. When I was your age, they just didn't happen. It was unimaginable. But large profit, there's a chance for huge profits and bubbles. All right, next, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Still around, they regulate the stock market. Now, there was an initial one in 33, but that was temporary. 34 would be the formal bill, even though we counted as part of the first New Deal. And the two of the big things were, it said that companies must be transparent. It became a penalty and even a felony if a company lied about their revenues. You can imagine companies would want to exaggerate their revenues so their stock values go up. Now, they still do it all the time, but it's harder to do now. And it really depends on the president. The president is more pro-regulation, they'll have a stronger SEC or vice versa. They also tighten margin rules, but same deals. Margin rules now are a lot looser than they were in, let's say, 1980. But here is Roosevelt kind of pulling the Democratic Congress towards this idea of that Security Exchange Commission. That's about 10 years ago. And this also banned insider trading, where people could get inside information about, let's say, if a company was going to come up with like a new innovation, or something bad might happen to the company and they kept it secret. Insider trading they would kind of leak that out. It wouldn't be transparent. So some people could either buy or sell stock to take advantage of it. For example, it almost certainly happened that some word came out about COVID. And that allowed people to invest in pharmaceuticals and also sell shorting, but bet that companies would lose money because of COVID. It was some of the information about how bad that first run was going to be was hidden. And yeah, so that's an example of that. Another one. Here's something that people don't talk about as much. In fact, it's hardly mentioned at all. It's one of the most important things. Roosevelt got the country off the gold standard. This was one of the things that Hoover tried to hamstring them with. He tried to make Roosevelt say he would stay on it. And by getting off the gold standard, it allowed the Federal Reserve to inflate the currency. What that means is create inflation. So the money goes from being tied to the gold standard to what's called, it's floating free in the market. That's called fiat currency. So it's not backed by some other artificial thing that the government doesn't control, like gold, or for example, in European countries backed by something they don't control, like the euro. And that allowed them to pump up the money supply. So it said gold standard temporary drop to 8 prices. This immediately allowed the Federal Reserve to pump in currency. They didn't do it too aggressively, but they did some. Looking back, they probably should have done more. This also dropped the price of American goods in the US to make them cheap, to make them cheaper overseas to help exports. Every country, they all did it reluctantly because the gold standard was like stability. But every country that abandoned the gold standard immediately had a financial boom. Immediately. That because the gold standard was tying the hands of the Federal Reserve. So what happened was this. For example, Japan went up the gold standard in the middle of 1930, and the economy started to grow. Britain, Germany, US. France made a big deal about getting back on the gold standard after World War I, and they stuck with it, and their currency and therefore their economy remained deflated that entire decade until near the end. And when they finally went off of it, they were behind everybody, and this would really hurt them when they started to rearm before World War II. You probably guess about that coming. I should add one more thing about the gold standard. So Roosevelt's going to be attacked for this, and people immediately said it's going to create massive inflation. The value of money will drop. We'll be using it as toilet paper. We'll become Germany in 1923. What's called hyperinflation. No, that doesn't happen. As long as the country can tax and pays off its debts, money's actually more stable with fiat currency because we control the dollar, the country, the US. We don't control the gold. We don't control it. You can't just all of a sudden make gold. Can anyone here make gold? Buddy? I was going to make a deal with it, but all right, you can. After World War II, the US partially went back on the gold standard, but totally went off of it in 1970. We've been fiat currency since. And the financial system has been much more stable. I know it might not seem like it at this moment, but that's because people forgot how unstable it was before. All right, so with that, he was also intensely anti-monopoly. As soon as he became president, they began to aggressively enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt is the trust buster. So here's his shadow, looking down on his cousin. And so they enforced the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the biggie, they used the Federal Trade Commission to aggressively stop mergers and aggressively stop monopolistic activities. And there would be massive lawsuits. For example, against one of the first things we today call a supermarket. Have you heard of supermarkets? It was called A&P. And a big lawsuit that went on for years to break that up. And there were other laws passed, most famously Wright-Patman, but other laws that would be for the next 40 years aggressively control monopolies. Not 100%, but aggressively. And that leads to more competition, more innovation. And what does antitrust, breaking up monopolies, do to wages? Raises them. You break up monopolies, it raises wages because more companies don't have to compete. If only one company is hiring, that keeps wages lower. Or a tiny little group of companies, it keeps wages lower. That is just basic economics. Beginning in another conservative Democrat, Jimmy Carter. So years ago, somebody put a Carter Mondale, 1980. Poster on my door. I didn't do it. He lost to Ronald Reagan that year. And I've left it up there seeing how long it will last. And it's been for about 7 years. It's kind of like my broom experiment. So that's why I have that, the Carter Mondale from 1980. A conservative Democrat, they began to say, well, monopolies aren't always bad because they're more efficient. And beginning in 78, but especially when a conservative Republican named Ronald Reagan was elected, monopolies, they just haven't enforced it. Today, I put that on there because the Biden administration, and this goes against Biden's past, he was not really anti-monopoly, but it's been the most anti-monopoly since the 70s. So I don't know what long-term shift that's going to be, but it's actually very big, much more than anybody who pays attention to this thought was going to happen. Of course, let's say if President Trump is reelected, yeah, it counts as reelection even though they skipped a term. That will reverse again. We'll go back to being total monopoly. So, it kind of depends on that. Moving on. Another big one, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. This provides insurance for mortgages. So banks will be more willing to give mortgages to people and therefore encourage home ownership. And so the FHA, this is especially for first-time homeowners, So many years ago, when my wife and I bought our first home, we got an FHA loan. And that would be because we didn't have a home yet. We were just starting out. We didn't really have, a lot of collateral. We didn't have equity built up in another home. And so that allowed us to buy a home. It was a big deal. And that allowed us, therefore, to have the value of that home when we sold it. We bought the home we live in now. It's a big deal. Now, I put 40 to 65% of home ownership, or home ownership would eventually go from 40% to 65% by 2005. So 65% of households had their own home and owned it. And that's pretty remarkable. It was down below 30 or down below 40% when the war began, World War II began. And part of the FHA would be, this was included in something I'll get to a little bit later called the GI Bill. And so to allow it for veterans. And so home ownership became part of what's going to become in the 1950s that American dream. And even people who don't have home, it was very important to own a home. Homes mean a lot. You own a home, that means wealth. It's wealth. You own it. And if you don't own that home, you don't have that wealth. And also, you can deduct your mortgage payments and property taxes from your taxes. So you pay less taxes. So it's a big benefit to homeowners. Everybody who owns a home gets huge subsidies from the US government to own that home. Yes. Good question. Does anyone know? I mean, it's really hard. These are vague numbers because it's so variable and changes all the time. It's about 55%. It appeared to be going up a little bit, but there weren't really that many homes nationwide built on the whole in the United States after the financial crash in 2007, 2000. And then when COVID hit and it kind of changed the way people live, it dramatically changed the amount of homes being built. And so more people were partially because there's fewer homes, prices have gone up. But like if you go to Bozeman, houses are still pretty cheap. That's me lying. I just saw a small, they call it a starter home, selling now in Bozeman for $1 million. I can't. I mean, how do people afford that? I mean, the median wage in Montana is about $50,000 a year. How do people afford that? Yeah.
So what is this percent of? Like, is it of all people or is it like households? Oh, so just like all the houses.
They count, and that's why it's hard to figure out totally, but they got individual units that they call it. So if they could rent that house or they could.
Oh, okay.
And so, really important bill. But I should add, everybody who owns a home, they are heavily subsidized. They get massive government aid. And so, myself included. And so, yeah, we get direct welfare payments to own a home. And my guess is if your parents own a home, they're getting direct government aid to own that home. Unless they paid off their mortgage. But even then, you still get a benefit from your property taxes deducted. So you actually get government aid. It's a big deal. Almost everybody gets huge. Everybody gets government. But who's going to get this aid? And so the FHA, this was not mandated by the Roosevelt administration, even though the Roosevelt administration's in charge. It just kind of happened within the administration. They went to cities and they began, here's Philadelphia. And they began to divide it up. Okay, what areas will get the loans? And what areas are so decrepit and the property values are so low, they won't get the loans. And they called it redlining. So they went through and they drew off areas. This is Philadelphia. This is the map from 1939. And they drew it off. And areas in a red, it's decided, the property values are so low, the areas are so decrepit, we won't give mortgage insurance. And if you won't get mortgage insurance there, it's harder to sell your home. Harder to sell your home. What happens to the home values? They tank. They just tank. And then they said areas in yellow were more likely areas in blue. Yeah, we'll be giving loans like mad. So they, right? And this was, the whole idea was we got to be responsible to the banks. We do this, we don't want to spend too much. But it basically went on the poor areas in town were redlined. So no federal subsidies for mortgages. As it turned out, inside the administration, their definition of an area, we're talking 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, were areas where the majority population were Black or other what they called minorities. Minorities were people who were not likely compensated. This was divided up. And so this was already kind of segregated neighborhoods anyways. I'll tell you what, you go to a big city where they have major redlining. To this day, you cross a line. It's totally different. You can just tell, because property values are low, the homes they don't have the same amount of upkeep because there's not enough money there. My mom grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. And so the redlining areas, you go to the north side of Omaha, and you literally cross, what is it, L Street? It's weird and creepy, yeah. Sure, that was pretty common, yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where it comes from. It's usually the poor side, but a lot of times it had to do with color skin. And my mom would talk about this. She lived in Omaha, and it was the white section. And right across, he's about 3 blocks away, was a railroad. That was the other section. Especially Black men who went through her neighborhood had to walk. They couldn't walk on the sidewalks. They had to walk in the and the thing about that is, it was a long time ago. But since it's a lifetime of somebody who I know very well, it's really not that long ago. If it's in the lifetime of somebody it's not that long ago. It really isn't. So what it's going to create is this kind of long-term poverty, because house is wealth. And if you have this group of people that never really can build up wealth, what are they going to pass on to their children? Oh, hard work, not hard work. I mean, we all have. I mean, people work harder, not harder, all everywhere. But just that little bit of wealth makes a big difference. And so that's why even after the law was repealed in 1968, the legacy would go on. Boy, was this a fight. The last major civil rights act from the 1960s of Lyndon Johnson. And for example, Martin Luther King was marching for a stronger law in Chicago, and a group of white protesters worried about their property values dropping attacked him, and he was hit with a brick and set upon. Things thrown out, they kind of had to rush him out. He was nearly killed. Ironically, 2 months later, he would be killed. So redlining is kind of a big deal. But this is all the Public Works Act all over the United States. But while this is going on, we got to get to a couple more things. What were the results? The first New Deal did boost confidence. It did help the economy. The economy grew. Here's 33 right here. You notice it's stabilizing in 33. The economy grew dramatically, but it wasn't big enough. And that's why you have this thing where Roosevelt maybe does have another card to play. It was so new, and these numbers were so vast, they just didn't realize it's going to cost more money. It's going to require, we have to borrow money to get us out, or let this go on forever. It wasn't quite big enough. And this is the reason why. Unemployment remained very high. Here's the official unemployment rate. And I must add, even by 34, it's official, it's over 22%. It was a lot higher. Remember, I told you they couldn't measure this precisely. But they didn't count the jobs created by the PWA, the CWA, the CCC. This is the real unemployment rate, counting the jobs created by the government. That makes no sense. A job's a job. We live in Helen. If they didn't count jobs created by the government in Helena, the unemployment rate in Helena would be about 60%. So. But one more thing we have to get to. This is something, isn't really done by historians, it's more done by editors, people trying to quantify the New Deal. But they came up with this concept of 3 R's to try to divide up the laws. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think this is very good historiography, but it's something I have to tell you because since editors and test makers do this could be on the APUSH. So we got to understand these terms. And I'll explain why it's not very good in a sec. But the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform. Relief. So these are just to provide immediate relief to people suffering, like FDR. Remember, that was the direct aid we saw in the video. Recovery could be agriculture, could be industry, any number of things to try to get the country moving again. Like, for example, this is the biggest of the public works program I'll get to tomorrow called the WPA. And reform to keep it from happening again, like the FDIC. The problem with trying to divvy it up with like, FDIC or GlassSteagall as only reform, the FDIC and GlassSteagall also help recovery and it provided relief for the bankers. The WPA built everything. That provided jobs, that's relief. That provided recovery, it's got the economy going again. And by building the infrastructure of the United States, it provided reform. You see why trying to divvy it up into 3 is a little bit difficult. They actually, you could say, do all of these. FARA is most certainly these 2. And so know the 3 R's. Know what they mean, relief, recovery, reform, because that's the kind of thing they put on the AP exam. So we have to know. We're good on that one? And we got the 3 things down. I stole it from somebody else because it kind of, as you can tell by the way I'm presenting this, it kind of annoys me. The simplistic way of trying to do themes, because that doesn't show how everything literally is tied together. And you also notice I'm always constantly trying to say how this relates to today. I should add, all of you, as the year goes by, you're all doing better. It gets easier, right? Because you're getting the connections. Okay, some of you might not be getting easier, but a lot of you are. So look at me thinking, shut up. You do it. Actually, we didn't have APUSH history. All we had was a rock. And we would look at it and an American flag. We would just stare at it and then contemplate our rock. Huh? We had a brush with greatness. Of course, how would he have been? 4. So, FDR, I mean, maybe you could argue, wow, what a great job he did. He had enemies all over. It's hard to find a president that's going to be more beloved than Franklin Roosevelt. We can't even describe how much people loved him. But those who hated him with a passion that's hard to put into terms. So, conservative, more on the right, they despise Roosevelt. Now, some of the basic reasons we talked about. As they saw that went completely against trickle down. Social Darwinism, if you believe in that, helping the unemployed is actually hurting them because they're supposed to be poor. Which I'm always pondering that. It's better to let them starve. And so bills like, you can imagine, where's my mouse? Mouse. They were opposed to the regulation. They hated any direct aid, including jobs to workers. Oh, they were all for giving money to business. They had no problem with that, but they're supposed to get money. Remember, they're going to bill. And they really hated Roosevelt's tax policy, which I'll get to tomorrow. I'm not being strong enough to when I tell you how much they hated Roosevelt's tax policy. It would be a 40-year battle to get rid of it, and they finally would in 1980. And then also race. Especially conservative Southern Democrats. Remember, there's only Democrats in the South. They were opposed to the fact that Roosevelt's programs did not discriminate when it came to jobs. I know the FHA, we already talked about that, but not the public works programs. They said no discrimination. It infuriated them. And so they immediately said FDR is a communist. Now, what did they call people who had policies like Roosevelt, these populist-like programs? What did they call them before the Bolshevik Revolution? Remember bomb throwing anarchists? Now they're communists or Reds. So here's the Roosevelt New Deal with this socialist experiment. Look how they draw that kind of anarchist illusion. Here he's acting like a king. And so you're going to get a lot of the very wealthy saying this whole democratic thing has got to be stopped. Democracy is not working. That allows people like Roosevelt to be elected. Yes.
Okay, the unstable technique, the communism, the anarchism, but mine was passage on the sixth grade brain because honestly, those words were thrown around the so little brain and happy trouble crazy.
They're throwing, now I'm trying to give you the meaning now, but when people say it today, yeah, they don't know what they're talking about. I've heard people call me, somebody looked at what Biden passed that first COVID, the first relief bill they passed. And I heard somebody say, this kind of fascistic, socialistic programs have got to be stopped. And those are literally the exact opposite. But why are they saying stuff like that? Even they might not know. I mean, they might have no idea the person's saying it. But even if they know that most people aren't scared of fascists and they're worried about the extreme of socialism. So they're just trying to scare them. You know, they're just like Hitler and Stalin. They were mortal enemies. Okay, moving on. And the big one they hit him with is saying he's a traitor to his class. He's a traitor. He's one of us, and he's passing laws like this. So I have to tell you a story about how long and deep this hatred was. Now here's Roosevelt, from this rich patrician family, and he's passing laws to help working people. He was a populist, like the old-time populist of the 1890s. I know people throw out the word populist now, but usually they're acting like it. Here, I mean, he was the real deal of talking the old 1890s populist. So George Herbert Walker Bush was president, elected in 88, served one term. His son was George W. Bush, the president. It was when you guys were born, right? Is that right? And so George Herbert Walker Bush in 1990 would join this little brief period of great popularity. Boy, would it tank in 2 years. But his wife, the first lady, Barbara Bush, had this little burst of popularity, and she was seen as almost like the country's mother. She wrote this children's book about her dog, and they try to sell it. Like, oh, and she did little readings to kids. And she was very, part of the elite, but she at least had this kind of homey feel. So I had burst of popularity. She was doing an interview with this journalist, Barbara Walters, one of the first serious news journalists that they're kind of allowed in. That was a woman. Normally, the women would be forced to do like the lower level jobs. Barbara Walters was a big deal. She passed away last year. She was in her 90s. Pretty amazing person. But she would also be the one that do the interview with the first lady. She gave great interviews. Well, every first lady, if they do anything after the New Deal, will be compared to Eleanor Roosevelt. Because Eleanor Roosevelt had more impact than any other first lady in history. This is an amazingly talented person. Agree or disagree with what she wanted, amazingly talented. And so Barbara Walters asked Barbara Bush, said basically, a lot of people are comparing you to Eleanor Roosevelt. But that's really one of those softball questions. She can say, oh, it's nice, but I just tried to. No, Barbara Bush, he got mad and goes, stop. Said, we don't mention that. And that was 1990. Barbara Bush was from old wealth. Her family despised. She was in high school. She despised Roosevelt. And the Bushes despised Roosevelt. Barbara Bush was a Pierce. Remember Franklin Pierce was president after the Civil War? Yeah, she was old money. And so even in 1990, despised Eleanor Roosevelt. The hatred is going to be extreme. Some were so mad that they would organize a coup called the Wall Street Putsch. Putsch is another name for a coup. The American Liberty League, they probably do veterans, but it's mostly funded by some of the wealthiest Americans that were violently opposed to Roosevelt. And they decided that Roosevelt's going to lead this country. They didn't see him as Stalin, but they say Roosevelt's going to so weaken us, especially this dangerous democracy thing and labor unions. We're going to become Stalin would take over. We got to stop it. And so, along with support for some of the wealthiest families, and this, the amount is vague. These are all little backroom deals. And these were little secret conversations. So we know bits and pieces, but let's be clear about it. We only know certain facts. Almost certainly JP Morgan Jr., the financial banker, supplied money, and the DuPont family, chemicals, gave money. We know the American Liberty League was greatly supported by Henry Ford. And so they began to organize an effort to overthrow President Roosevelt at the end of 1930s. Yeah. We'll get some communists. Communists hate it. Yeah. But Roosevelt said communists. So they hated it. Which then, of course, Roosevelt, can they see? Both extremes hate me. So, good question. And so they attempted to overthrow this. And here is, that's a DuPont. That's Al Smith, the former presidential candidate who thought Roosevelt betrayed him and also became part of this. And their goal, to have something like their new idol, Benito Mussolini, the creator of the fascist party. Why Mussolini? The biggest thing was he destroyed labor unions. Now, someone in here knows a lot about this already, because he did that in special topics. But Mussolini used veterans of World War I, dressed in black shirts, funded by the very wealthy, to march on Rome in 1925, terrifying the conservative king, who allowed Mussolini to take over power and eventually become dictator. Does anybody remember any veterans marching on Washington, D.C.? Do you remember that? Let's create the bonus army again. And their plan was, now we'll arm them, and give them uniforms and march back. And we need a leader, a hero, one of them, General Smedley Butler. Yes, his name was Smedley. The most decorated soldier in the United States military at that time, who was a supporter of the bonus army, a retired general. They asked him to lead it. Smedley Butler heard them out and immediately went to justice. Told what happened. Here is Butler on a newsreel film telling what happened. He was a Marine. Butler despised Wall Street. He was in basic diplomacy. He went to Nicaragua. He went to Haiti. He killed thousands of Haitians revolting against American domination there in 1924 and got medals for it. And looking back, he decided and would write a book that he was a gangster for Wall Street. They went to the wrong guy. They thought they could buy him off. But the problem was, when the Roosevelt administration got this news, I should have all the people involved with the coup hit the cup, they're gone. Roosevelt probably incorrectly decided, I can't arrest them all. Because if I arrest them, some of the richest Americans might be involved. That might so destabilize capitalism, they might get what they fear, or communist revolution. And so they didn't arrest people. There was a haphazard and milquetoast congressional hearing. Yes, it occurred, but there's all these kind of vague areas. Oh, it occurred. Roosevelt, looking back at it, hindsight's a beautiful thing. They should have arrested them. They should have frog walked them. You know anything about frog walk? Handcuffed. You ever see when they're handcuffed and they like cover their face and they protect them and they walk in like this? That's called a frog walk. They probably should have put them on. Instead, they didn't. Could it have happened as Butler was a different general? I don't know. Oh, the plan was he would make himself a department of a new cabinet called the Department of the Homeland. And become like Mussolini. That was the plan. It could happen here. But hopefully not. Oh, wait, we just had a coup a couple years ago. Wow, life is exciting, isn't it? Have a good day, everybody. Electric Circus?
I'm reading it. I don't know.
Tomorrow.
Cool, I like it.
I
Saturday, May 14th?
walked downstairs reading it and my mom started reading it too and I was like, sorry, I don't know what's on it.
Well, that's very excited for tomorrow. You gotta figure out what it is. Oh, we gotta get done.
Nah, I don't know. It's
So truth is already busy.
It doesn't. It doesn't. Nothing conservative, we need more parties.
Why do they have more parties? Want me to tell you? So instead of it's winner take all on your here, then you function. It's gonna be up for 15% of the vote. Party is 50%. So that includes, well, winner take all, you have to pass.
I didn't know why, I was just like, we get the parties, we have different names.
That's, no, the problem with that is, it's hard for one party, majority, take the leader, chancellor, so you have coalitions. But that's not necessarily bad. Who's on your shirt? It's Grover! Now, wonder if someone in here watched the very first Sesame Street. Could be anybody's here. When it was brand new. And what am I doing? Oh, I have to improve my name. This,
Oh, yeah.
all right, goodbye, everybody. Carry on. Do good works.
Oh, I think I was. Oh, yeah, there is. Yeah, guys. Maybe. Today.
Yeah. Good there.
Yeah. What? I'm having a meeting. Sorry, I don't want it. Hey, this is like gone, I saw it's been great. Oh, so you guys. Wow. I'll be back. Taylor's not back till Tuesday. Miss the next. Well, Wednesday. Wednesday. Wait, and then the next one. Well, I'll be. Yeah. Like this whole week after. Yeah.
That's good.
That's why it is. She doesn't somewhere else. Tell her, actually. So, one minute, please tell her. I don't know.
Temperature.
I just saw this out.
Not in San Diego. It just seems warmer. I mean, maybe just the sun being higher, but it's just 25. Oh, no. It just refreshed 33. When the sun is higher, it just feels warmer.
No, not have a bite of my sandwich.
Check the forecast. Rain off spring break. No, I mean, it's just. It better not rain Thursday. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. That kind of.
An inch of snow on Sunday.
Yeah. I'll be in two sides. So I'll be ready.
What's snow there? I'm checking Tucson right now. 4 feet of snow right in Tucson? I just do always do. Cool, fun. Good time of year if it gets too hot there. Let's see what we can sort of find. Perfect. You don't need a sheet of paper because I don't need the extra copies. I'll just write on that. How's the stapler? It's a good one. It's a good one.
Yeah. Oh.
Spring break.
Oh.
Oh, I forgot. Oh, well, I'll get it later. Look at this. Look at the crinkle cut. I did that. Each individual
Fries? Oh, I didn't know. I don't. Cut fries in there. Waffle fries.
So, do you want a quiz tomorrow? Well, originally I wasn't going to, but I've been listening to the, cheap talk on the street. The voice of the people, they come through my ear. I have no earbud, I'm just hearing things. And I'm having conversations with them back. No, I decided not to give you a quiz. We won't have a quiz, I'll give you a homework, but we have to, but let's allow sufficient to deal and everything happens right then, at least for half the period, I want to show part of that video I didn't show you earlier, so let's go and get done on this. And I thought I saw that later.
I love to go to Spain. So, yeah.
Did you think we're Spain today?
Yeah.
She didn't tell me that.
Just so you know, yeah.
You didn't tell me that. Well, somebody, I guess we'll have a quiz tomorrow just for her. Yeah, that'll be the week you have to make up. The rest of you did really well on. That's my revenge. All right. So let me backtrack just a little bit. Oh, and everyone has the, so everyone does have now the spring break joy. Let me help you with one thing on the spring break joy. And if you don't have it with you, maybe just jot down the margin just so you get it. It's called the double B. And the double B might be hard to find. I'll let you do it. Go ahead. Yeah. Even though you're doing the quiz. The double B, that was part of the civil rights movement. You need it. The double B was victory over racism and victory over fascism. And they really tried to tie together the fight in World War II, the fight against Nazi Germany, Japan, tied together as one battle also as a fight against racism in the United States. And it obviously was not successful right during the war. They kept the segregated armies, etc. But it would help lead to the modern civil rights. So that's okay. And so the notes, remember the asterisk, just put down the basics. The ones without asterisk, just a little more detail, a little bit of cause and effect. This, the World War II, from those chapters, that would be due on the Tuesday after the break. What's that, the 4th? Is that right? Doesn't matter, it's a Tuesday. The next credit movie on the Monday. If it's rated R, please get a signature. I told you about that before. Okay, so. What was about plot? I guess they're playing Jenga upstairs. And that's why I heard this wood fall, like this collapse. I thought like the bridge was coming down. And so. Go ahead and I'll give you 1 second. Anything else I need to explain? It's all you. Would it help if I stand and loom over you? Doesn't it help people? Does it, don't you like it when tests and someone just kind of goes? What? I'm gonna do it. I'll do it right now. It's out of 50. Let me hand it back to you. It's out of 50. And almost all A's and B's, I thought people did very well on this. And was scared to ask, and she should have. Thank you for asking. Yeah, all A's and B's, I thought it was very well. I didn't know what happened. Oh, it's down. I saw your name. It's out of 50. Everyone's out of 50. So 45 and above, people did very well on this. I was very, very, very pleased. All right, so. Yeah, the big thing is most people just didn't have like enough, a little bit more explanation. And the matching was. It's one you can't figure out. I know. I know. I could have done a whole alphabet soup one and just have all the acronyms of all the New Zealand. And do you want that? We could do that. No.
Do you think they have like a list of like, oh, RRC is this, and you like little sheets?
Or they have someone behind them. After you do it. Okay, just to review then. What were those talks that Roosevelt did to try to sell his programs? Yeah, the fireside chats and a brilliant use of the radio. And we had fireside chat. What was the bill? What was the law that gave direct aid to people? Money. Yeah, FERA. The FERA, direct aid. And we had Roosevelt's inauguration. What was the great line he had? What really was talking about the bank panic and what was going on. The great line in his inauguration. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But he's talking about the panic. Talking about the panic. What law would create jobs for young men to go out? Not a lot, but it was a big deal still. And recondition forests, build trails, that kind of thing. CCC, what law would try to boost agricultural prices by paying farmers not to grow? The yes, the AAA, the AA. Did we get to that?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that right now. Movie right here. So let's go. The AA, overproduction. That's the biggest problem. Farm prices are too high. Now, let's also remember, people aren't buying food, but so many unemployed, that the problem is multifold. But the way they look at it is we got to get prices down.